Hello, I'm Michael Brown, President of the School for Advanced Research. I'll be your host for this Creative Thought Forum event. I'm speaking to you from my office on the campus of the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the nation's oldest state capital. Before I introduce Ned Blackhawk, who will be joining us from New Haven, Connecticut, where he lives, I want to acknowledge some of our sponsors. These include the Palo Jaime Foundation, Adobo Catering, the Flora Crichton Lecture Fund, Luke and Betty Vortman Endowment Fund, members of SAR's Founder Society, Newman's Own Foundation, Thornburg Investment Management, Santa Fe Dining, and Dan Marian's and UBS Financial Services. Events like this, like our many events, are made possible by the generous support of members and donors. If you'd like information on becoming an SAR member, please visit our website at sarweb.org. One quick comment before I welcome Ned to this event. The conversation, I should say, will last about 40 minutes, and we'll have a little bit of time for questions and answers. So if you have questions for Ned Blackhawk, please put them in the Q&A panel, and I'll process them as quickly and as sufficiently as possible. Ned, why don't you join me? There you are. Thank you. Ned Blackhawk, Western Shoshone, is the Howard R. Lamar Professor of History and American Studies at Yale University. In addition to the book we'll talk today, Professor Blackhawk is the author of Violence Over the Land, Indians and Empires in the Early American West, 2006, winner of the Frederick Jackson Turner Prize from the Organization of American Historians. He is also an SAR Resident Scholar alumnus and currently serves on SAR's Board of Directors. Ned's book, The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of U.S. History, is a very ambitious work. And so the first question I want to ask you, Ned, is what inspired you to take on a work of this scale that goes from at least 1519? I don't think you got the Vikings in this one, but it goes from 1519 to the present day. It's a tour de force, and I imagine it probably took you a lot of time and a lot of, as a Western historian, and dealing with other parts of the country that might not have been so familiar to you. So would you care to comment on that?
Sure. I'm happy to reflect on the origins of this big project and to share some insights that may be helpful for the SAR community listeners today. I'm a Native American historian by training and volition, and so I've always kind of loved being in and around the field of Native American history. It's kind of become not just my career, but in many ways a really driving passion. And I've always thought of how best to do certain things as both a scholar, as well as a teacher or educator. And I have always also been very disappointed, essentially, or ultimately, with the state of Native American history on the national level. There has been tremendous growth in this field over the last generation. I call this growth, or this generation of scholars, participants in the rediscovery of American history, hence the title. And even though the field has grown prodigiously since I started graduate school in the 90s, since I started teaching in the late 90s at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, there still remains really like calcified, sedimented knowledge within the profession, and obviously across the country as a whole, that has kind of foreclosed possibilities for thinking about some of these subjects. And so both on a kind of scholarly superstructure level, and also in a kind of everyday kind of classroom setting, there have been very few single volume overviews of Native American history. And some of the most important books in like the Western history or the history of the Spanish borderlands are often these kind of single volume books that kind of open the field and provide synthetic and interpretive overviews and pose questions or share contemporary findings. And for whatever reasons, probably because of the temporality, the spatial, the ethnographic diversity of the subject, there haven't been kind of sufficient attempts to bring Native American history into a single kind of classroom adoptive text. I'm not going to say that this book is comprehensive, especially in your community and kind of in the kind of deeply informed world that SAR has helped cultivate. This is, I think, a healthy endeavor towards hopefully a larger undertaking.
Thank you. So precisely for the reason that you just raised, I want to ask you about some things that I found absolutely new to me, and having taught, obviously to a more limited extent than you have, Native American history in my days as a college professor. I was struck by one thing. I'm sort of skipping ahead from the 16th century to the 18th, but there's a long section, very detailed section of the book about the native inland sea, that is 1701 to 1755. And for me, this was an aspect of European relations that I knew the least about or never really understood comprehensively. Could you talk a little bit about what that refers to and why it was so important to both the native communities and to Europeans? I was also struck by the important role played by the French, something that tends to get downplayed in American histories of the colonial period.
I'm really happy to talk about these chapters, because each chapter, there are 12 relatively substantive chapters that are trying to bring together often regional or kind of temporally focused themes of Native American historical inquiry. And there are 6 in the first half of part 1 of the book, which I divided into 2 parts. Part 1 is called Indians and Empires, which is essentially a 6-chapter overview of what we would call the U.S. colonial era, or in Canada or some other places they may call it Native newcomer relations. And it ends part 1 with the ratification of the U.S. Constitution in the late 1780s. In part 2 then, which is titled Struggles for Sovereignty, is a 6-chapter overview of the history of essentially federal Indian affairs and the relationships between tribes and external federal communities and state actors since essentially not independence, but since the constitutional formation of the United States. So 1787 is this kind of incredibly central date in the history of the United States that hasn't been, I think, sufficiently utilized to think of Native American history as a kind of demarcation limit. So chapter 4, which follows not just chapter 3, but chapter 3 is on the French Empire's formation along the St. Lawrence Seaway in the 1600s. And it concludes with this historic agreement called the Grand Settlement of 1701, conducted in Montreal in the summer of 1701, when the French governor invites nearly 2,000 native leaders to the island city or village community, and agrees essentially to limit the forms of warfare that have made the 1600s potentially among the most destructive eras of Native American history. And that era of destruction is partly fueled by all the destructive influences that European colonialism initially wrought: diseases, new technologies of violence, motivations for economic exchange that are unprecedented. And so the kind of turbulence of the 1600s comes in certain ways to a certain degree of stability in the end of this century of instability. And a new era essentially is initiated, in which the French, with their Algonquin-speaking allies largely across not just Eastern Canada, but also the 5 Great Lakes regions, and their antagonists, the Iroquois Confederacy of 5 and soon thereafter 6 nations, essentially with British kind of eventual recognition, establish a tripolar world that the French and their allies will maintain a fur trading, religious, missionary influence, not quite symbiotic, but mutually constructed world, the Iroquois will have a certain degree of autonomy, recognition, suzerainty over other indigenous satellite communities, and most importantly, economic access to both the British and the French, which is kind of unprecedented given the antagonisms between these Protestant and Catholic empires. And then the British Commonwealth world, the British North American colonial world. That tripolar world will eventually collapse with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, in which the French will lose the North American Empire. And that will set in motion chapter 5, the American Revolution. And you can't understand any of these imperial and revolutionary conflicts, particularly from the 1740s, 1750s, 1760s, and then 1770s, without understanding the imperial and indigenous alliances and relations that are at the heart of this world. There are, in 1650, less than 3,000 French settlers in New France. That number will grow dramatically by the end of the French Empire in the 1750s and 60s, but will never exceed 100,000 settlers. Across a region that stretches from the mouth of the St. Lawrence, through the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi, onto the plains, north approaching Hudson's Bay, this vast colonial world is dominated by Native peoples. And they've spent, more than a century interacting with other indigenous and imperial actors. And so the loss of that French Empire, which is the culminating moments of chapter 4, the Native Inland Sea, is a tremendous disruption to the history of the continent. But prior to that, there was this half century, which the chapter chronicles, a half century of, I don't want to say relative stability, but sets of social relations and engagements and trade and alliance making that cemented indigenous and imperial interests together at times throughout the early 18th century. And it's the loss of that cement, so to speak, with the imposition of what we might call a British mortar or some new British foundation that won't congeal well in the 1760s. And that will in turn precipitate this incredibly important but under-recognized conflict known as Pontiac's War, which will generate, as I write in chapter 5, this really intense anti-indigenous ideology from backcountry British settlers who think and fear, they worry much more about Indians and Indian affairs than they do tea taxes along the coastlines. And so anti-Indian sentiments, ideologies, and practices are essentially a major fuel for the American Revolution. And it's not incoincidental that the last complaint of the Declaration of Independence against the King of England is that he's inciting what the colonists call merciless Indian savages to attack our frontier communities. And that term frontier is first used in the aftermath of Pontiac's War, when the British government, like the French Empire, British monarchical government, like the French Empire beforehand, is attempting to diplomatically resolve the military conflicts across the Great Lakes regions, particularly in places like Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, the southern Great Lakes regions.
So let me ask you about that, because that was another insight in the book that I found astonishing. Most of us were taught that the opposition to the British came about because of the Stamp Act and so on. And what was really striking in your book is that that grievances of interior peoples against the British were just as important, and it had to do with opposition to the way the British dealt with Native Americans, whereas the settlers, as you've just said, really gravitated to a much more hostile approach. Could you talk about that? I mean, that really kind of blew my mind to be.
It blew my mind too when I was writing this, because in some strange way, Native American historians have always known that this field hasn't been sufficiently recognized. And that whenever we encounter usually somewhat celebratory or biracial or somewhat, truncated paradigms for assessing American history, we always know that there's something wrong with them because they don't talk about like the indigenous peoples of America. They don't talk about the oldest permanent communities in North America. They don't talk about the demographic, economic, political, military kind of power of Native peoples throughout the course of this period. So the revolutionary hagiography, which dominated much of the 20th century, is in many ways still kind of institutionalized. And so even though obviously these are not singular causes of the revolution,
Sure.
The point of observation that you may also kind of want to recognize in addition is that these interior concerns predate those concerns along the coast. And so in January, February of 1763, this Treaty of Paris is like welcomed as this, unprecedented historic development. And British settlers in most of the seaport regions and across agrarian and gentry communities are like their British counterparts and English counterparts in England are, ecstatic about the victory that the English crown has just established. What happens in 1763 that unmakes, that's, this theme of unmaking paradigmatic assumptions about America is one of the arguments of the book. What is it about 1763? And the chapter 5 kind of chronicles some of these things. The Treaty of Paris, that summer in the spring, the winter and spring of 1763, is celebrated across the streets. It's, eulogized in Sunday service. It's proclaimed in British press and English press. In the summer, Pontiac's rebellion erupts, and there's this deep interior conflict that's making peace for the British or the English more costly than war. And so what do the British do? They passed the Royal Proclamation in the fall of 1763 that limits British settler expansion into the interior. Well, what happens in a place like Pennsylvania? These interior settlers get upset. And what do they start doing? They start attacking Indians who they think are trading with the Pontiac's allies and Confederacy leaders and further in the interior. There are all these Delaware communities, some of whom are massacred in December of 1763 at a place called Lancaster. Those, they're called the Paxton Boys. These basically militia units that are forming. I titled chapter 5, Settler Uprising, in which these settler militia groups like the Paxton Boys and later a group known as Black Boys further west in Pennsylvania, just totally begin taking politics into their own hands. They march on the Capitol in 1764. Benjamin Franklin writes a pamphlet condemning these atrocities. And then the next year in 1765, they start marauding British caravans heading to Pittsburgh at Fort Pitt to trade with Pontiac's allies. They essentially start revolutionizing their ideology and discourse. And so I say in the book that these are not, they're not robbers, they're not raiders, they're rebels. They're trying to establish a new political system and ideology, and they use things like leafletting and protesting and masquerading as kind of part of their discourse. And this is all happening before the Stamp Act is ever passed and initiated. So that kind of sense that Native history has been so thoroughly kind of excised and marginalized in national histories has to kind of, I think, be named and unmade before we can really fully rediscover our continent's history.
So let me see if I understand one thing about that. Basically what you're saying is the British were trying to restore or continue to maintain a peace through trade and gift giving and that sort of thing, and the settlers found that utterly objectionable, and that precipitated these raids on British caravans of goods that were headed for Native Americans. Is that about right?
Yes. And the very influential scholar of the Great Lakes has a chapter in which he calls the book is called The Middle Ground, Indians and Empires, Republics in the Early Great Lakes region, terms this the restoration of the middle ground. Essentially, the English inherit the French Empire, and also unwillingly and paradoxically come to inherit the obligations, the sense of economic in particular, but also diplomatic and kind of mediative, kind of jurisdictional, juridical practices that the French provided. And it's kind of, just a tremendously deep irony. And I think I say something along these lines, that ultimately the British and the Indian leaders in the interior didn't realize who the most threatening combatants were. And it's the British subjects who won't follow either governing structures that Native and or British.
Yeah, understood. So Ned, I want to ask you about something that I don't think you talk about. I couldn't find it, and I looked at the index, and so it's silence that I thought was interesting. Native historians and also non-Native historians have insisted that the U.S. Constitution was inspired by the Iroquois Confederacy, although the claim, as you know, has plenty of critics too. But I couldn't find any evidence that you either argue for or against that claim. Was that silence intentional? Did you just decide to stay out of that debate?
That was a debate that was occurring when I entered graduate school in the early 90s. And it's called the Iroquois Confederacy hypothesis, or the Iroquois constitutional hypothesis about the centrality of the Iroquois to the eventual federalist systems that inform the U.S. constitutional system. I did not fully engage that debate because it has remained inconclusive for a long time. And so one of the goals of this and ambitions of the book is to try to bring together findings that other scholars have kind of determined and try to incorporate them into conventional existing paradigms of American history, like the Revolutionary Era or the U.S. Constitutional formation, or the next chapter, Chapter 7, the early Republic. Chapter 8 is on the Monroe Doctrine and foreign policy affairs of the early Republic as well. Mm-hmm. So if I were to make a claim about this Iroquois hypothesis, I might lose some of the constitutional historians and or legal historians who would find this claim perhaps a little exaggerated. And I do make some suggestions that Franklin, in his Albany Plan in 1754, is in New York, right as Washington is actually in the interior in the first phases of the war, the 7 Years' War. I do make some suggestion that both Franklin and Washington have some familiarity with interior and indigenous affairs that is very distinctive from Adams and Jefferson and the other Virginians, who essentially have never spent much time in the interior world. And that's one of the tragedies of American history, essentially, is that many of the founding figures we associate with the earliest years of American statecraft understood Indian affairs differently than subsequent generations of state leaders. And we've kind of lost understandings or kind of appreciations, essentially, of those differential comprehensions. And if we did understand Washington and Franklin's relationships with Native peoples more thoroughly, we might be in a space to invite heavier consideration of this debate about how the Federalist or centralized political structure of the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee Confederacy was a model to which the colonists eventually turned. I think they did it wasn't informed, and I do make some claims that like the subsequent colonial Continental Congress called their governing body the Council Fires, just like the Onondaga Nation serves as the Council Fires, the Confederacy. There are these kind of slight suggestions, but I think more importantly, to be honest, the place of Iroquois and interior Indian power was much more of a determining factor in the evolution of the governing system of the United States than were existing Native political systems, because those existing Native political systems, like the Confederacy, generated the influences that forced the colonists to recognize that only a federalist system could organize the independent states, and all the states ceded that authority to the federalist system during the Constitutional Convention. It's one of the few agreed upon consensuses that percolated before and during the Articles of Confederation and then into the Constitution itself.
Let me ask you about that. You argue, I think, vigorously that Indian affairs were extremely important, or an important force leading to greater federalism. That is Washington, well, or Washington-based control, eventually Washington anyway, as opposed to the sovereignty of individual states. Can you unpack that a little bit and talk about how it went and what kind of reactions it produced?
I think if we can understand these two centrally important foundational documents in American history through this lens, or through a lens of Indigenous history, we'll see that the merciless Indian savages of the Declaration is a form of essentially authorization of anti-Indigenous violence that was evident at the time, but that by the time the Constitution is ratified or established in September of 1787 and then ratified thereafter, governing leaders like Washington understood that violence of this kind of magnitude was inherently antithetical to political stability, and that there had to be mechanisms for adjudicating conflicts, as did Native leaders. It's a kind of underwritten history of the Constitutional Convention, but there were Native delegates from particularly the 5 civilized tribes who came to Philadelphia and kept trying to remind the new governing leaders that their government, the Articles of Confederation, had already signed treaties with, numerous Native nations. And so treaty making remains the kind of determinate federal Indian policy and affairs throughout not just the early republic, but really to the end of the Civil War era. And the treaties become the supreme law of the land in the Constitution. They're outside the House of Representatives. And I write in chapter 7 about the early republic how treaty making helped essentially oil the wheels of American statecraft, and that by passing Indian treaties and figuring out how to make treaties with Native nations, the federal government essentially learned how to make treaties with subsequent nations. And so Jay's Treaty is this really interesting treaty that has Indian kind of fingerprints all over it, so to speak. And if we can think about the Constitution and the Declaration as having been forged out of these contexts, we'll be able to answer the types of questions that you're suggesting. But at the moment, we're kind of still in the space of a little bit of reticence about really jumping fully into this type of scholarly conversation.
Interesting. So, as you know, treaty making was conventionally said to have ended in 1871. How did that happen? Why did it happen? And what are its implications going forward?
I really enjoyed many of the moments of deliberation and kind of analysis that I stepped into at a certain point throughout this project. And there's this incredible, I think, underwritten history of the growth of the federal government over Native America during the Reconstruction era that, again, has been largely overlooked or marginalized within the study of American history more broadly. And so the power that Congress is giving itself after during and then after the Civil War is really just unprecedented in American history. What had been the most divided, kind of ineffectual branch of government becomes its most strongest after the war, particularly during Johnson, kind of his ineffective post-Lincoln presidency. So all of a sudden Congress, having not touched the Constitution in 60 years, they passed 3 amendments to it, right away. And all of a sudden start giving themselves this incredible power to do things that it had never really done before. And so sadly for Indians, in a sense, the existing practices of federal Indian diplomacy continue, where the military and the Senate and the treaty-making process continues for 5 years after the Civil War. And some of the most important kind of historic treaties with the Navajo and the Ute and the Fort Laramie and then Medicine Lodge. Some of the largest and most important treaties in American history occur in those 5-year periods. But the Congress essentially starts realizing, hey, wait a minute, there's way too much essentially power and authority occurring outside of our deliberations. Let's just stop doing this altogether. And it's not much of a debate. It's really a rider that's put into an appropriations bill. And essentially thereafter, Congress begins assuming, more and more control over Indian affairs in ways that it hadn't. So much so that it can start subdividing reservation lands. Where does it get that authority? It can start, breaking treaty commitments. Wait a minute, treaties are supposed to be the supreme law of the land. What happened? All of a sudden, all the provisions that the federal government had spent like a century trying to ensure become subservient to congressional authority. And this kind of growing doctrine of plenary power that Congress has kind of just inherits, by the time the 20th century begins. So the end of the treaty period, is occurring in this larger, turbulent kind of post-Civil War world in which the federal government is just giving itself so much new authority to disavow previous commitments, to institute new ones. And this is where things like boarding schools and allotment, religious persecution, past systems, reservation, kind of unbridled authority of superintendents, all kind of has its origins.
On a somewhat different subject, could you talk a little bit about the impact of slavery and how that affected Native American communities, and also white notions of race, which don't seem to have existed before or were fairly recent historical developments in comparison to other things you talk about?
We've known each other a while now, and I'd have to say that question couldn't be answered in a short period like this. So we may want to have another webinar just on that question if you want, because we're talking about kind of voluminous set of subjects that ultimately, I guess I would say, we have to create a kind of conceptual universe where scholars, educators, politicians, judges, citizens, students can have a sustained conversation in which neither Native American dispossession or African American slavery are the original sin of the United States. There has to be a space where we can see the interrelated, interconnectedness. And so in chapter 7, which is on the early republic, I try to go through the formation of American whiteness in a certain way, the legal formations that are occurring largely in response to African American slavery and the threats posed in the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution. But nonetheless, their implications for Native America, because if the federal government is naturalizing, as it says in its 1790 Naturalization Act, one of the first things Congress passes, that only white people can become citizens of the United States, this will then be a big question for the Republic thereafter.
Right, but obviously intermarriage, interracial marriage also complicated, and still to this day complicates Native American identity, right, in some parts of the country. So it's an ongoing issue that everybody's struggling over.
And it has its origins in history.
Right. So here's a big question. And when you look at, especially say from the late 19th century to the present, you just see this wild kind of oscillations in the way the National Society deals with Native Americans. So you've got allotment in the Dawes Act, which wants to blow up or individualize property ownership for Native Americans. Then it's reversed in the 30s with the IRA, and there's some reaggregation of communities others couldn't, followed by termination in the 1940s through the 60s, which is again reversed. Thankfully, it wasn't systematically implemented, but it certainly, the Menominee case is famous, but there are others I assume that were also affected by it. And that gets followed by a period of kind of acknowledging sovereignty. So how do you explain these, and I think we're probably in another, we seem to be going to another sort of a period that's hostile to sovereignty and the distinctiveness of the Native American case. So what does that say about our society? Is that an answerable question? I don't know.
Well, you're right to point out what federal Indian legal scholars might call the pendulum of federal Indian policy, how it swings and differentiates between certain kind of assimilative or incorporative versus exclusionary and or recognition based forms of autonomy. So what and this is a debate that, essentially the Washington Jefferson tensions we were talking about or alluding to earlier were present then. How do we deal with these interior communities? Is it all diplomacy, statecraft, or should we also have missionaries who are Christianizing? And this term merciless Indian savages, in certain ways, is still with us in this kind of doctrine of federal Indian law that presumes the lack of tribal governance, the lack of tribal communities to self-govern themselves, that they lack civilization, that savagery is not just a kind of form of barbarism, but it's a lack of something too. And so in the kind of hierarchy of cultural civilizations, Native Americans, we always come out, pretty low in that evolutionary scale. And particularly, as you may know, my first work was a big critique of the ethnographic work of Julian Stewart, who said that the Great Basin Indians were the most primitive peoples of the world, right? And he thus thereby testified against our federal recognition efforts in the 30s. Fortunately, he lost. So, this kind of lingering sentiment that tribes and Native peoples are somehow different and thus should not have distinction or jurisdiction or criminal authority, is really ingrained into American law and policy. And so these kind of swinging pendulums always have within them a certain element of, sadly, cultural hierarchy that is at odds with the actual legal pluralism of American history and society. And we are in a new era of both incredible resurgence of Native American cultural and political and economic activity, but also a kind of Rehnquist, Roberts Court era of either backlash and or resistance to Native American sovereign expressions.
It used to be said, and you can correct me if I've got this wrong, that there are more Supreme Court decisions dealing with Native Americans than any other single category of Supreme Court decisions. Whether that's actually true right today, I'm not sure, but clearly that's also indicative of the complexity of this long history that you detail so well in the book. Currently on the docket, as some of our viewers will know, is a review of the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, or ICWA as it's called. Do you want to say anything about that? Where do you think, what does that, aside from the whole adoption issue itself, which of course has a history that you talk about quite a bit in the book, what are the implications for Native Americans if that goes against, if it invalidates ICWA?
It's a sad moment when the long fought hard legislative victories of Native American Cold War activism fall under fall onto the shoals of an unfriendly, and to be honest, this is kind of one of the elements that we were just talking about, the kind of misunderstandings of the nation's court, the misunderstandings within the nation's court system. The Indian Child Welfare Act was passed in 1978. It followed, an incredibly long, harrowing history of Indian child placements into non-Indian families. And the remedy, essentially, as you and maybe some of your community members there may know, was to ensure the prioritization of Indian child placements into family, tribal, and or other Indian family custodial environments. It's that last component that's being challenged in ICWA, whether or not other Indian families is a racialized category of legal preference that is at odds with the 14th Amendment, other constitutional provisions around equality. And it's just really sad if we can't, in our society, understand the origins and necessity for recognizing Native American kind of legal and political and constitutional distinction in a non-racialized form, in the political sense. And that's what the previous earlier case, ensuring the placement of Indian employees into the Bureau of Indian Affairs, known as Mankari v. Morton, kind of enshrined that doctrine. And so if this doctrine falls, Mankari likely may come next. And so hopefully there will be kind of modified provisions within potential rulings, and then subsequent legislative advocacy to remedy or fix in a kind of legal constitutional way these mishaps essentially from the court that can now be ratified, because it's like one of the interesting paradoxes of plenary power is that when used poorly, it becomes a justification for incredible disruption within Native America, but has within it, like federal Indian policy more broadly, a capacity for recognition and deployment in which tribal communities can utilize the congressional power of Congress to get these things established. So we're kind of seeing this kind of back and forth with McGill and now Castro Huerta, these kind of pendulums of cases that are overturning and then remodifying these important doctrines of federal Indian law.
By the way, just a little SAR advertising. We did a webinar with two Native attorneys after the McGirt decision, and you could find that on our YouTube channel. It's one of the most vigorous and interesting discussions that I led, I think, since I've been here. So I'm going to turn to the questions. It looks like we only have one, which is so far anyway, which is unusual. So let me just put forward by Garrett. It says the received wisdom is that the horse was widely traded to tribes because of the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, but new evidence shows that Spanish horses reached Plains Indian tribes many decades before, as published recently in an article in Science. Do you have any comments on that?
You know, I looked at the article and really was incredibly happy to see such an extensive collaboration working to remedy this one this well-established historical paradigm. What I would say is I haven't read the entirety of the article, and it was written, the article came out after I crafted this volume. And so the volume is in a sense dated by those findings. I would say it's worth kind of reconsidering this era. The prehistory of the Pueblo Revolt essentially is really kind of shockingly understudied. It's partly because so many documents were destroyed during the revolt itself in the 1680s and thereafter. But there's this, and I cite, I think there's an important SAR collection, even on anthology on this era. I can't remember its title off the top of my head. But the demographic and kind of social and kind of just in a sense archaeological transformation that's occurring throughout the 1600s is not as sufficiently understood as it should be. We all know about Oñate and his arrival into the 1590s. We know more than most Indian uprisings have been studied about the Pueblo Revolt itself, but the interim hasn't been sufficiently interrogated. So I'm really excited to hear that this article is making those types of claims. But if you go down the street from SAR to the Palace of Governors, you will see the Sagasher Hyde paintings from the 1720s that show a lot of pedestrian travel and warfare still happening on the plain. So I don't know how prevalent equestrianism became. It's likely that, as the article claims, that there were horse trading was occurring, but whether that engendered the levels of subsequent equestrian transformations is less clear and would have to be kind of assessed in a sense before and after 1680, because my guess is that the 1680, the aftermath of the revolt is still a major generative force on that kind of larger equestrian transformation that's occurring. It's just nice to see a more historicized and deeper account of this subject, especially occurring in a prominent publication like that.
Mm. So we've got two questions that I'll combine into one from Anne and Dave. What's up next for you? You're probably so exhausted after publishing the book, you might just want to rest for a while, but what's next on the agenda for Ned Blackhawk?
Well, I'm not exactly sure, but I'm excited to have this project kind of not just completed, but kind of out in the world and circulating. I really appreciate, Michael, your effusive remarks. I haven't gotten, partly because the book came out during an academic semester, I haven't gotten a lot of scholarly responses yet. I'm still waiting for those, a lot of kind of anecdotal. So I'm really interested in forms, as Michael knows, of academic kind of institutionalization around Native American studies. And there have been insufficient numbers of professors and programs and courses and things, particularly at the leading private universities of the United States. These are the universities that control the largest sets of resources, the largest endowments, and perhaps actually some of the most influential, or at least generous alumni. So how do we kind of continue to raise the kind of scholarly profile of Native American history and studies in ways that is intelligible or connected with kind of academic and spaces, but do so in concert and collaboration, often with Native communities themselves? These are the kind of dynamics of 21st century Native American studies that are occurring, and they're really exciting. There's the new NASA conference. It's not new anymore, but the 21st century has seen the rise of Native American and Indigenous studies into an academic association that has its own journal. It has its annual conferences. So I'm really kind of still in this process of trying to secure funding and create fellowships and train, if I can, graduate students, and encourage undergraduates who have interest in these areas. But I do have a kind of academic project or two kind of forming, but I'm not sure when they will take flight.
Well, maybe on that note, we should end. The book is The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of U.S. History. I'm sorry if a question was asked and we didn't get to it, my apologies, but my recommendation is buy this book. It really is a remarkable piece of scholarship, and I enjoyed reading it. I didn't enjoy carrying it on an airplane. It's a very heavy book, and it's long, but beautifully written and amazingly informative. So congratulations, Ned. And thanks a lot for joining us today.
It's been my pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully pretty soon.
Good. I look forward to it.
Take
So
care.
long. Thanks to everyone who joined us today.